The new is very old. In fact, it's probably the oldest thing of all. So said Eugene Delacroix, who's the subject of a tremendous retrospective at the Louvre at the moment. But right now, from a lot of people's perspective, the old feels pretty old. Our visual culture is absolutely saturated with millions of instantly downloadable digital images, which can make the art of the past seem very remote and distant, particularly to younger people. The American political philosopher Patrick Deneen has recently talked about a pervasive amnesia about the past. And European old masters, which are the traditional backbone of European or world collecting, now constitute less than 10% of auction sales. And yet, last November, a painting reattributed to Leonardo da Vinci made $450.3 million in New York, the highest price achieved for any work of art, admittedly in a contemporary art sale. Now, let me turn to you, James. You're director of one of the great encyclopedic museums. How do you see the dynamic of old and new in your museum?
I mean, in some ways, I think it's a very familiar, but perhaps false dichotomy, right? We are a museum almost encyclopedic, presenting experiences across time and cultures from roughly the Bronze Age to the present. So one's experience of our institution as a visitor is, we hope, on a continuum. And so this dichotomy of old and new, I think, ignores that continuum. That said, of course, our museum is engaged in these juxtapositions, as many of our peer institutions are. I can give you some examples at present. We've just closed a presentation of 24 paintings by the late Indian painter Imam Hussain, a cycle of paintings documenting the history of India from the ancient world through independence, which we installed in our Southeast Asian galleries. At present, we have a major collaboration with Shanghai and Beijing of ancient Chinese bronzes. It's our principal special exhibition of the moment. And throughout our museum, we have two projects. One by Wang Dongling, who is, of course, the great master of Chinese ink, working in a calligraphic mode with large colored panels. And another Chinese artist, Xu Longsen, who's working with charcoal landscape on felt. So these juxtapositions, these are two examples where we're putting, well, three including Hussein, but two at present, where we're putting old and new together. But I think, very importantly, with some degree of specificity. So Wang Dongling and Xu Longchen are both artists working in very traditional modes, and the conversations that they're having in relationship to our bronzes is specific. This is not about Jeff Koons in the old master galleries. So I want to answer the question by putting it on the continuum and then also hopefully engaging with some degree of curatorial specificity.
And juxtaposition is creating a vibrant sense of continuity across the periods.
I think that's the idea, is not to so much shock the old and the new, but to put the continuity into relief.
Okay. Tobias, there's this talk about cultural amnesia and so on. I was speaking to you earlier, and you mentioned that you were bidding on the Leonardo Salvator Mundi for a collector who hadn't bid for a major old master painting before. Tell us about that a bit.
What was very interesting about the Salvator Mundi when it came up is that immediately when it was announced, several people that I worked with called me to find out what I thought about it. Now, I will say my opinion about the picture is irrelevant because I'm not a Leonardo da Vinci expert, but what was interesting is that there was immediate response to the appearance of such a painting on the market. And it caught the imagination of people in a very succinct way that in my experience clearly was outside of the old master market. It became something completely different. It became a symbol of the artist as a star. It became the identification of the Salvator Mundi with Leonardo da Vinci was very powerful. So it transcended any of these previously established old master approaches. I also think, quite honestly, popular culture helped. The Leonardo da Vinci Code, all these sort of things that brought people out that, like I said previously, would never consider.
There was a Dan Brown connection there, wasn't there?
Yes, there was it helps, you know. You
Absolutely.
need to, the attention span of many people that we all work with is not very long. Now then, what we did is we did talk in depth with the people that had attributed the painting to Leonardo. We talked in depth with the conservators that had worked extensively on the Leonardo. And then the collector made a decision how far he would go and what he would do. It was his decision, not mine. I liked the painting, but again, my opinion did not matter.
Okay.
And I kept saying this to people that had opinions about the painting.
But contemporary collectors often have very, very discreet and confined tastes. What made him, or her indeed, break out of the box?
I would say that it was an interest in genius.
Okay.
It was an interest in participating and owning something from a genius, more than an artist.
Okay. Jorge, you're actually a specialist Old Master dealer. What did you feel about the whole Salvator Mundi experience, as it were, and how it invigorated the market?
You mean the Leonardo? Well, to me, I think, you know, I'm an art dealer, but first I'm an art lover. And it was very important, the campaign that Christie's did, because you could see that people who were looking to that painting most probably were not going to bid, but there was a reaction to the painting. And this is the kind of things that happens when you are in front of a masterpiece. The masterpieces are the only artworks that are able to emotion people by the creation of other genius. You know, it's a human feeling. So, you know, that's the important value, how you can create an emotion on another person, and that's how, you know, you get to this kind of prices. How you can value an emotion, how you can value a song, or how you can value a book or a shield that, you know, move nations. That's what is the Leonardo. It's going back to the culture, going back to our roots, to our history, and that's why people who were, you know, crying in front of the painting had that reaction.
Okay, but James, we were again chatting beforehand. It's another factor is that it creates lines for a museum, doesn't it? That kind of image, and I gather one of your trustees was bidding on it also, which is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Tobias is saying about the pop culture connection, you know, was made not just legible, it was made absolutely explicit, not only because it was in the contemporary sale, which I think really merits further reflection. I mean, I think there's a tremendous degree of cynicism reflected in that decision, frankly. And also that it was...
So I'll jump in. Do you think that was an absolute masterstroke?
Pardon me?
Was that a masterstroke, putting it in a contemporary sale?
I suppose it was because of the results. There's no arguing with the financial success. But I think in terms of how we structure and understand connoisseurship, arguably not. And the fact that it was bolstered by Warhol, right? That it was, you know, the sort of enfilade of the approach to the Salvator Mundi was Warhol's Last Supper. Again, I think the cynicism there is rather bald. It's interesting, but I think it's also troubling. And not because I'm a purist, but because I think anything that elides connoisseurship in favor of promotion is something we need to be alert to.
Okay. I was there in New York. I looked at the lines and chatted to lots of people. One thing about that experience was that most of the people who were excited by it tended to be older. And even in the case of that extraordinary result and the media campaign and so on, for me, when I go to exhibitions, it's very noticeable for Old Master exhibitions that the demographic is quite old. Now, I just want to talk about how much of this is a sort of a generational issue, resistance to old art, and what are the factors inhibiting the next generation being excited about older painting and older art?
Well, that's a big challenge. When I took over Colnaghi, which was founded in 1760, I had the clear mission of taking the company to the 21st century. So we have a saying in Colnaghi, which is, tradition is not to keep the ashes, but it's to keep the fire going. And to keep the fire going means change whatever you need to change to engage people, you know?
You've got an interesting grand tour idea.
Yes. Well, the key words, I think I'm very attached to what, you know, the director of the Victorian Albert said. It's accessibility, scholarship, because people want to learn. And education as a future way of creating a new audience. We are creating new concepts because this accessibility is about the format, about the attention span that maybe it's sometimes 2 minutes. So what we are doing is creating experience so they can learn. The Grand Tour project, which is going to take place next year in Venice, it's to make people live the life of a Grand Tour. That could be an 18th century Grand Tour, that could be Mr. Frick, J.P. Morgan, Isabella Stewart Gardner, Bernson, Sargent, the painter. So what we're doing through our archive, that goes back to the 1760, plus all the archive in the Mellon Library, is to research real facts, diaries of the trips of these important people, and rewrite the diaries. But what we're doing is rewriting the diaries through Instagram accounts.
Okay.
So people will have private Instagram accounts where they will follow the life of these people, and by following those shots with the explanations, they will live that life. And what we are doing is setting up the mind of a collector in the people.
Okay.
So it's a new way.
Goethe would have loved it.
Yeah.
In terms of older art, another element I think that's worth thinking about is that for some young people, the past is another country which persecuted minorities horribly. And I'm just wondering, in terms of museum, how you sort of navigate these issues when you're trying to encourage the appreciation of older art.
In terms of developing new audiences?
Yes, with younger audiences.
And again, I think when you look across the spectrum of an institution like ours, our great icons, the most popular pictures with Strive attendance, none of them are contemporary. Our highest attendance in terms of exhibitions are not contemporary shows by and large, although they can often cross into the early 20th century, Picasso, for example. I was reading some materials prepared for the panel this morning and noticed that in 2017, the highest attended exhibition globally was ancient Buddhist sculptures in Tokyo. Nearly 12,000 people a day coming to see ancient Buddhist sculptures. So in a way, I think that we don't have a job to do that is engage in singling out the old versus the new. We have a job to do in terms of defining access and inclusion across the entire spectrum of our programmatic mission fulfillment. And so our ability to tell expansive stories in the ancient world, in the old master world, and the contemporary world, I think the obligation is exactly the same.
Okay.
And so, for example, a recent acquisition, we were talking just before, one of the rare conversations we're having about old master Spanish paintings that didn't involve you in the last few years, is the acquisition of a painted crucifixion, 1646, by a woman named Maria Josefa Sanchez. As we all know well, to have a signed, dated, painted object by a female maker in that moment is extremely rare. There are only 4 other known signed paintings by Maria Josefa, 3 of which are in convents. So we had a story to tell about rarity, we had a story to tell about quality, but we're adding only, I'm embarrassed to say, we're adding only the 3rd pre-modern female maker to our collection. Right, so we want to tell stories that are expansive. We want to define a greater sense of inclusivity across the full spectrum, and contemporary methodologies can be applied to the ancient world and everything in between.
Okay, I'll come back to you in a moment, Tobias. Jorge, you've had some success with 17th century Spanish sculpture. My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that American museums seem quite keen to buy it, reflecting the changing demographic in America itself. Is that the case?
Yes, actually we've been quite successful, and we're very happy for that, because what we're doing is exporting our culture. I'm Spanish, so for us it's very important that the rest of the world can understand the quality of our art and our culture. So the important thing is that the quality is there. We try to look for niche markets. It's a quality it's been overlooked. People is not taking care of that. So the quality talks, but who listens and how listens, that's why we want to sell to museums. For me as a dealer, I know that if I sell to a museum, that piece will never come back. So it's an effort. But I think it's an effort that's worth, because we are able to expand that culture in a much bigger way.
Tobias, there's lots of talk about the domination of contemporary art in our visual culture and in the market. But actually, there's been quite an emphasis in broadening the market towards the 20th century. Now, you speak to some very, very important collectors. How has their thinking about collecting changed in terms of their attitude to the past? Has it become a bit more expansive, a bit more eclectic? How's it changed?
I mean, I have to preface it, I left Sotheby's in 2013, so my perspective now is one of a private dealer and no longer of an auction house. At the auction house at the time, when I was there, and probably it reflected in a way the auction peak, let's say 2007, when we sold the Kun's Heart, there was an enormous sense of everything was bought. It didn't matter how old it was in the contemporary art field. You could buy something for $18,000 one year and 2 years later sell it for $550,000. Those were the sort of the profit spreads that happened continuously when a young artist was engaged with the market, and then the auction market produced at something else with it. I think that a general trend now, as I perceive it, but it's only my personal perspective and not that of the general market, is that people are much more quality conscious and conscious that there are opportunities in the 20th century that are not necessarily of art of today. That you don't have to race to the exhibition of this artist and try, come hell or high water, buy something, or if you can't, buy it at auction. That you can find interesting work by other artists that are mainly or sometimes have been seen as marginal, but are actually not marginal, but just marginal in the market, and they could be very interesting too. So I see that.
Okay. James, you've been fortunate enough to have a tremendous gift to your museum with the Gail Neeson and Stefan Edlis collection. It's interesting in terms of terminology because it's regarded as a contemporary collection, but so many of the great masterpieces are 50, 60 years old. And I'm just wondering how that sort of dynamic between old and new works out, because they're historic works in a strange way, aren't they, but regarded as contemporary art. Would you like to talk about them for a moment?
So are you trying to unpack an old-new dynamic within that Edlis Neeson framework?
Precisely, it's regarded as contemporary, but you're actually looking at a historic painting, aren't you?
Right. I mean, interesting, so people probably may not be familiar. It's a collection of roughly 50 works of art that tells a story beginning with the kind of pre-pop, and then kind of the heart and soul of the collection is pop with Warhol and Lichtenstein, and then a kind of generation after of kind of, post-pop, whether it's Hearst or Charles Ray or Sidney Sherman, Richard Prince. So there is a line through, I think, from, again, pre-pop with Rauschenberg and Johns and Twombly through Warhol, and the most contemporary work in that collection is Murakami from 2011. So I think there is a continuum, I think, that we think about there, and in so many ways that collection gift, which was the single highest value collection gift in our 140-year history, was of course transformative, right? We were able to benefit from the gift of pictures that, both in terms of quality and price, we never could have begun to access from a market perspective. And so in that one regard, it was this absolutely exceptional story that was transformative to the story of 20th century art that we can tell for our visitors. On the other hand, in some ways, for us in Chicago, as in so many museums, it was business as usual, right? We are a collection of great collections. So from, our great donors that beginning in the 1890s who were, buying Impressionist pictures when Monet was still painting, Mrs. Potter Palmer buying the Grand Jatte, when it is 18 years old. We had this tradition of Chicago collectors engaging in their own moment and then creating, in a way, a portrait of an eye at a certain moment in history. And so we have that, again, from Impressionism, Post-Impressionism through to Surrealism, and now that Edlis Neeson is a cap. So again, my answer in a way reflects my first answer too, which is, in some ways, we do want to always understand the specificity of a project, but also try to articulate where it sits on a continuum of experience and history.
Okay. Jorge, I also want to, I've been thinking quite recently about the way we look at art and observe art. We've been through a period of incredible technological change. Are old masters facing a serious challenge? Because when they were created, the assumption was that the person who looked at them would spend 5, 10 minutes à la recherche de temps perdu. A novelist dies in front of a Vermeer. When you look at people in art galleries, they look at them very, very quickly. Is this, in a sense, a systemic problem, this new way of seeing driven by the digital age for all pictures?
Well, as I said before, the important thing is that I think that what is endemic is how the dealership in the old master world has been treating the audience. That's what we need to work in. The old is not old. What is old is how we've been approaching to our audience. We have so much content, and behind a Vermeer there's a collection, there is a composition, there is a symbolism, there's so many things that you can talk, but the way you explain them is what will maintain the attention of the audience. So that's the important thing, the formats, and that's what we work in, how we can create this wow factor that people get incredibly engaged with the work of art, and then they want to want more. So what we want to do is to wake up sensibilities. Sensibility, at the end of the day, it's your skill to find the hidden beauty on things. Once you are able to understand and enjoy that beauty that you were not able to see, you are immediately engaged. So what we want to do is to create these formats and show the people how to find this secret beauty and then engage. And then they will move forward, and they can be 10 minutes or 25 minutes.
Okay.
That's the point.
Because there's been some very interesting research by MasterCard on millennials and their consumption patterns, and the shift in psychology towards experience rather than possession. And Tobias, I'm very interested in what that impact of that might be on the world of art dealing, for example.
Well, we talked about this before. I keep coming back to an article that Gombrich wrote in 1972 about the over-visualization of our culture then. And he talks about the fact that we as a population become more and more victimized by the symbol and by arousal, by visual arousal without context. And that is something that is very interesting, and I think that there is a generation today that is not so riveted by possession, but they're riveted by imagery, and they're riveted by the arousal of imagery as Gombrich defines it. And it's a very interesting article to read and something I recommend. But I also think that in general terms, and I know that there are certain people here in the audience that have dealt with this, experience has also become more interesting than possession. Not only the visual impulse that you receive from the image, but the experience while you go through it. So that's another thing that people, the younger people, people that are 18, 19-year-olds also talk about. So I agree with you that it is a challenge. How do we, as in my case, a dealer, find people that actually still want to possess something? And I think that possession at the end of the day is a very inherent quality in a human being.
Okay.
So I'm not worried about it at all. But I'm just saying that, there is a new generation where other elements of the art experience are as important as dragging it into its own cave.
Now, we'll be asking questions about E.H. Gombrich in a couple of minutes. Just one final question.
Sorry.
No, it's a nice reference. You're a museum director, you're not in the business of selling things, but do you have thoughts about how to present your material to create these memorable experiences in a different way?
Of course. I mean, again, institutionally, we don't have, there's a corollary to the points that you were making in terms of institutional models, in terms of whether it's millennial or any audience that wants to come to a cultural campus, not just for the experience of objects, but for a kind of a sense of a collective social experience. I don't know that we have the answer to what that's going to look like, but we're certainly aware that we need to grapple.
And is it something you're thinking about? And
Absolutely. Even as we contemplate, what the future might look like if we ever add more space to our campus, is there a way that we could think about expanding our facilities along a model that would not have been the model in 1998 or 1978 or 1928? In other words, more art galleries, cafe, bookstore, and visitor service spaces. I mean, what could it be? What could it mean to build a truly 21st century experience space that use the art museum as a locus for experience and not just for objects. And so it kind of breaks down along a number of lines. I stand by your point as well, Tobias, that we understand ourselves first and foremost as an analog experience. I mean, we are one of the few things in your day where you don't necessarily need a screen interface to interact with works of art. That said, we do also understand that it's incumbent upon us to use technology where we can to improve access and interpretive strategies. So this is really a half an answer, I apologize, but I think we're all trying to figure out how we navigate, that kind of core sense of who we are as a place where the first-hand experience with extraordinary works of art is primary, but then to also understand digital technology and experiential models that can be complementary. We don't have the answer, but we're...
Scott, I will add very quickly that what I say to my young collectors is that possession is the result of a good experience. When you do in a collection, you need to experience all the process, and that's the result of it.
Okay, let's have some questions, please.
Lisa.
Yes.
When you think about contemporary art, you think about museums like MoMA, the Guggenheim, the Whitney, that are essentially contemporary art museums, but yet they keep collecting. So the question of contemporary art is a very vague one at this point. Are they going to be contemporary art museums that represent 200 years of art? Where do you see the future of these kind of somewhat narrowly defined museums going in relation to this broader question?
I think in a way it can be there's a simple answer and a complex answer, perhaps. I mean, the simple answer is nomenclature. Where we cling to a notion of modernity and where we embrace a kind of forward-thinking language around the contemporary. In our museum, we do use two different nomenclatures, right? We do have what we present as a relatively discrete history of modernism, again, a debatable sliding scale, but roughly in the way that we use didactic materials from the 1860s to the 1960s. And then we talk about a contemporary period. So we've always created a certain elasticity in our model by understanding modernism as a discrete historical phenomenon and giving us the sort of runway to always be kind of pulling that tablecloth back to create, space on the other side for forward collecting. Other institutions that are specific to the 20th century and 21st centuries, I think, have a different challenge to define where those brackets are and how they define mission. But it's easier for a museum like Chicago because we're setting the modern and contemporary question that you're asking in relief against the ancient world. So putting it in that context of discrete historical experiences is a little bit more in our wheelhouse. I'm not sure if I'm totally getting to the challenge of your question. I guess I stayed on the simple answers rather than the complex ones.
But if I may say something that's also interesting, we talked about this before, this sort of idea of a continuum. Because I think that in our discussion, very often we say contemporary art against older art. And I think that, to me, is a flawed concept. Because it is a continuum. I sometimes even quote a letter where I quote an art consultant who says something like, "Dear sir, I'm coming to town. I'm trying to find modern pictures for you. They're not around. If somebody is there, I will be outbid. I can't afford them. What shall we do?" And this is a letter of an art consultant in 1624 to the Duke of Pomerania as he goes to Augsburg. And so I think this sort of idea that we separate contemporary art out from the past leads only to mistakes.
Can I ask you, Tobias, why is it important to maintain that sense of continuity?
Because it's all the same, and I'm lucky. I don't speak for a public institution. I can speak for my own. I find it a more rewarding experience as an art viewer that you actually don't separate it out. You see it all as a whole, because only as a whole does it become human expression, which it all is.
It's a matter of knowledge. You need to appreciate that. It's what Picasso said. There's no past or future. Every masterpiece should live in the present, and if it cannot live in the present, shouldn't be considered at all. It's a change. It's inspirational. You look where you're coming from to decide where you're going.
Any other questions?
I was going to say the exact same thing that you just did, Jorge, that, every object has a maker, right? You can have an artist-centric worldview that's not limited to the contemporary art world. You have an artist-centric worldview that also embraces the ancient world. And also every object, as you just said, speaks in the present tense or has to speak in the present tense. And that's our job on different sides of the equation to allow objects to speak in the present tense.
And I think it's also worth mentioning as a final word that they were all contemporary artists at the time, weren't they?
All art was once contemporary.
Of course. You have your museum of contemporary objects.
It's actually just amazing, I mean, to interrupt me for a question if there is one, but it's amazing if you pause. Sometimes it strikes me walking around our museum that there is not a single moment in history from the earliest date of prehistory to today. There's not a single minute, not a single second where human beings weren't making art. Like, it's incredible that it just didn't go fallow for 100 years. Like, people just stopped making paint, just it kind of went out of fashion to have a fundamental expression of human creativity. Like, it's ceaseless from the earliest moments of our existence until now, and that it's just kind of a simple but overwhelming idea that it never, ever, ever, ever stops.
That's a great final thought. We've got to stop now. Just some housekeeping notes. We're now having a break for the lunch and round tables in Hall C, which is a fantastic opportunity to enjoy in-depth discussions and pick the brains of a great range of experts. So please go off and enjoy that. And if we could have you back at 2:25 here, please. Thank you.